Hello, folks, and welcome to Gaming Through Sporting History. So this is my second series, this time looking at sporting games that have been a big part of my gaming life. In my first series, Gaming Through History, I was looking at um, historical strategy games and the relevance of those in my sort of like gaming life. And in the introduction to that series, I talked about sporting management games being part of my initial interest in the sort of strategic strategy game genre, and that was um, yeah, a big part of what got me into gaming in the first place. And so I did think, well, it would be a shame to have done that series, but not have spoken about some of those games and some of those experiences that really got me into the hobby. And in particular, we're going to be looking at these three games. Reflecting my own sporting interests, growing up in the UK, football, rugby, cricket, a massive part of our lives as we go through the seasons, from the crunch of rugby during the muddy winter season through to the joys of spring and summer when you're hanging out on the boundary, enjoying a game of cricket, and being a reflective soul, I was as drawn to games that looked at the strategic side of these sports, as well as games that looked at the actual playing experience of these sports. However, sporting management is still quite a niche genre, despite the interest that's out there. Um, it seems that some games, some sports are more easy to gamify than others, and that's sort of part of the story we're going to be exploring today. So these are the three games we're going to look at. Championship Manager 2010. Now, I chose this game for a couple of reasons. For one, for those of you who play football management games, you'll probably be more familiar with Football Manager, which is, the sort of dominant franchise in the space today. But prior to Football Manager, there was Championship Manager or Champman, and this game really did dominate um, my early gaming life and my sort of like mid to late teen experiences, regularly playing through the night as I tried to, you know, get Sheffield Wednesday into the Champions League or whatever it might have been. Um, a fantastic game, and obviously it's evolved and become, quite this behemoth. Interesting to record this video now in early 2025. Now the Football Manager has had a bit of an issue with its development and development of FM25. That would be the game that should have been released now but has recently been cancelled. Um, but this edition of Championship Manager is particularly noteworthy because it was the last of the Championship Manager games, and the Championship Manager team did split up with Football Manager coming out of that same early development team. So there was a very brief period where Championship Manager, and Football Manager coexisted, but then Football Manager has subsequently fully taken over, and this was the last sort of major mainline game um, from the Championship Manager house that looked to do exactly what Football Manager does now, which is create a whole world in which you could manage any number of teams to glory, domestically, internationally, etc., etc. So, an interesting game in its own right, in that it kind of tracks the evolution of the dominant franchise in the space and kind of marks the point at which Champman, the originator, if you will, ceased to exist. And it's a good game. It's a good game. No reviews on Metacritic. Metacritic clearly didn't have much of a broad impact, but very positive on Steam. And I particularly enjoy the game. And we're going to be exploring how Championship Manager 2010 has expressed its history, if you like, in the 15 or so years from 2010 to present day. And that's going to be part of how we look at how these games explore the sports, but also explore the worlds that those sports exist in and express through sort of the gameplay and player experience. Now, of course, football is a global sport with a huge following. The other games for cricket and rugby, however, are infinitely more niche. I think that's safe to say. Cricket, for those of you who aren't in the UK, is a sport that is certainly popular in the UK and basically has quite the colonial legacy as many of the nations that play it around the world today were part of the British Empire. It's a sport that quite remarkably has not managed to really jump out of that particular niche. But where it is played, it is adored in Australia, in India, in South Africa, in the West Indies. I mean, it's in the Caribbean. I mean, the West Indies is very much a construction of that kind of like, sporting colonial legacy. But um, where it's played, it is adored. But of course, it's not played anywhere near as much as football is. So it's funny that there are so few management games, strategy games that exist for cricket. And Cricket Captain is very much the flagship franchise for that genre. Um, and it strikes me as odd that that's the case, because certainly when you look at the number of potential consumers there are in India, for example, it's not that a cricket management game wouldn't be more commercially viable if it were more sort of like formally developed, but it is very much a niche game. And as you can see, again, no reviews on Metacritic. So again, a game that hasn't had much broad impact and mixed on Steam. And it's mixed largely because of the lack of innovation. And that's what I mean when I'm talking about sort of like major developers. There isn't really a major developer behind any cricket management games in particular, but also sort of cricket games in general. Despite the potential commercial successes and opportunities that it might be. But Cricket Captain has suffered for that through lack of innovation. And with if you follow the franchise, you'll see the screenshots that I sort of pepper through the videos. And even though we're talking about a game that is over a decade old, it could be from the most recent releases that are still going out annually now. So it is a game that, yeah, is representative of a lack of innovation in this particular niche genre of cricket management games. And one again, we'll look at how the last decade of sort of international cricket has been portrayed through the game. And this one I picked because there is a degree of innovation. You can move between nations in the game, for example, but one thing we're not going to be doing is, say, looking at the different Sheffield Shield winners or the different Ranji Trophy winners over the years. Because when you're playing Cricket Captain, when you start up a game, and that's as true now as it is of the game released in 2014, you pick a starting nation and you play in that nation. In later editions, you can, like I say, move between nations. So I might manage, say, Surrey in England and then get a job managing South Australia in Australia and move over there. But you can't see the game world. You can't see, when you're playing in England, you can't see the Indian League, West Indian League. You can't see any domestic structures apart from the one you're in. So then when you move over to Australia, again, you can't see the English one, for example. So yeah, crazy lack of innovation that even that isn't something that's shown. Because it would have been interesting to see, whether domestic teams showed similar kind of stories to the one portrayed in game, but we aren't able to do that because of the limitations and lack of innovation that Cricket Captain has had over the years. And then that brings me to Rugby Union Team Manager 2017, which is a step further in the direction of niche. Rugby is, yeah, it's curious that there are so few rugby games, full stop, and so few, well, I mean, no rugby management games. This is basically the one and only franchise that exists for this particular genre. And yeah, I mean, again, mixed on Steam, but yeah, pretty ropey. If you're coming at it from Football Manager and Championship Manager, you definitely look at it and you think, right, this has got some way to go. So it's very interesting how the three sports, have very clearly have sort of dominant franchises in this sort of sports management game space. But yeah, a lack of innovation is, particularly evident when it comes to cricket and rugby. And that lack of competition really sort of doesn't spur things on. And yeah, somewhat disappointing. It would have been interesting to see perhaps how different management games portray the history, perhaps do compares and contrasts like that. But like I say, few franchises to choose from and very different in terms of how the sports themselves um, are being sort of used for games in this genre. So, how are we going to look at the games? Well, it's interesting to think of it from a sort of historical standpoint. Again, we're looking at games that are set in our world. So, taking it back to the sort of gaming through history premise, when we're talking about a sports management game, in a very similar fashion as a game developer, you're going to have had that initial discussion about, what is the sport we want to profess, we want to express in a similar fashion to if you're developing a new edition for Total War or for Paradox, as we discussed in that initial Gaming Through History series. You're going to have the sort of initial premise of what is the context you want to create, be it historical or in this case, sporting. And then I suppose the evolution of game design and game development is again very similar. You have to look at the key elements that make that game a cricket game versus a football game. What are you going to include? What are you going to exclude? What does the player want to have as part of their strategic and management experience, and how well and how effectively can you implement that in the game? For example, there are a number of different football management sort of concepts out there. I've certainly played games where you build a stadium. Now, if you're a football manager, you're going to have very little input on land procurement and development of the facilities of a stadium. But again, do you want to include that as part of that holistic club building experience? Or are you very heavily focused on the tactics? You need to pick your players, you need to develop them, you need to put them in a cohesive setup, and then you need to work with them through the course of the build-up and the game itself to get the maximum output. Is it going to be again is heavily invested in the playing or in the sort of world around it? And I think in that respect, all of these games do focus on the playing. For example, there isn't much of that kind of world building that goes into these three games. More so in the football management scene, where you do pick your staff. You have a greater impact on training, for example. But again, it very very much depends on how you want to sort of express that game world is and that reflects then in how that gameplay is created, which in turn influences how the player experiences the sport. So similar to the historical sort of cycle, so is the sort of gaming and sport cycle. And these are the three features that I've kind of focused in on. So the authenticity of the simulation. So, if you are creating tactics and you're implementing them in the game, obviously these things are boiled down to sort of like codified rules that the game is processing, but how authentic do those simulations feel? How reflective are they of the actual sport that people have experienced in the real world? Integrity of the game world, so that moves it slightly outside of the game itself, more into the world around it. What inputs are going into the game and how effectively are they implemented? If you're talking about training, if you're talking about financials, how coherent is that element of the game? And then the realistic flow of resources kind of goes to that point of how do those two things interact? How does the playing of the game and the gaming world interact effectively so that you're getting a realistic expression as to how clubs and teams develop over time? And that brings it back to the central premise of, does it make sense? And I think sports games, again, it might go to the point of just how few management games there are for some of these sports, that it is incredibly complicated because you are talking about a lot of very personal factors. When you're talking about how a team is playing, a morale system, a cohesion system. There's a lot of minutiae that you can look to involve, but it's far more organic almost than a game that is historically setting, where you might feel it's easier to create a game with like very clear and obvious sort of economic and social structures. Sport is just a lot more organic. There's a lot that is just kind of luck and happenstance, and how do you integrate that into the game somehow? So yeah, there's a real sort of there's a real sort of like living dynamic between how a sport is played and how it's experienced, and that's exactly what a game in that world is trying to create. And I suppose ultimately what you're trying to deliver for the player is something that just feels authentic, something that just feels right. And I can imagine, and you'll perhaps see when we go through the games, that it's very easy to get that wrong if the game simply isn't well put together. So we're going to discuss key themes and general winners and losers from the game period we're talking about to kind of assess how these games do in expressing the game worlds that they're reflecting in their sort of historical sense. So we're going to start off with Cricket Captain 2014, and in a way, this is the world we're viewing. This is the world we're assessing it against. So about 10 years worth of international cricket. As I mentioned earlier, you can't see different domestic leagues with cricket, which is disappointing. But as you can see, Australia have been the more dominant force with two World Cup, ODI World Cup wins and a T20 World Cup. England won a piece, West Indies won, India won. And then down below, you've got the Ashes. So one win for England, two for Australia, two drawn series, but Australia firmly on top, if you like, with 14 test wins to England, 7 with those 4 draws. Now, the World Test Championship didn't exist in 2014, so that's not there. We will look at various other themes and kind of observations from the period. But in a way, what we're looking at is just how well the game does in representing this, just how coherent is it all, just how authentic does it feel. And these are going to be the 3 things we're going to look at. Focusing in on particular kind of observations. So number 1, Jimmy, what becomes of the legends? This period, 10 years in which Jimmy Anderson kind of became a legend of world cricket due to his longevity and high quality bowling, record wicket taker for England, a phenomenal career. And yeah, we'll look at his career across 3 different playthroughs and kind of compare and contrast, and then see who else kind of comes out and see how well they're represented. Secondly, the plight of the nearly men. Do South Africa win titles? It's kind of like, yeah, success and failure at the international level. South Africa in particular over this period have kind of developed a reputation of bottlers, high quality side, full of quality players, but they've consistently failed to get over the line and win international titles. I could have easily put India for this as well, because over this period in particular, they have fallen short. A team that is absolutely dominant, high quality side in world cricket, but another team that had struggled to win titles until they won the recent T20 World Cup. And if they hadn't have won that, I might well have said India ahead of South Africa because of their qualities, but because of their underachievement. Yeah, they actually beat South Africa, I think, in the title in that final, and it was a bottle job from South Africa. So South Africa definitely take the nugget on that one. And then finally, on the flip side of that, the unstoppable Aussies, Australia, year after year, generation after generation, churn out hugely competitive, high quality squads. Do they do so in the gaming world? Do they always have to win? Okay, so first off, yeah, Jimmy Anderson and the fast bowlers. So it's interesting that at the start of the game, so we're going back to 2014, Jimmy Anderson had already picked up 343 test wickets at 30.68. So that's how he starts the game. In our world, he goes on to finish his career having played 188 tests, to have picked up 704 test wickets at 26.45. So you can see he doubles the number of wickets he's taken, but he significantly decreases his average. And that is because of his high quality fitness and longevity, and his economy rate in particular. He becomes a very stingy bowler, picking up wickets, but at far more economical rates. And his average significantly drops from 30.68, which is good, but not great at test level, to 26.45, which is very good. There's a big difference really between a bowler taking wickets at 30 plus and a bowler taking wickets at early to mid-20s. Huge difference in terms of sort of the quality measure that that represents. Now it's interesting, how the game would represent this, because there's some very particular parts to Jimmy Anderson's career in this period that a game would struggle to represent. Number one is his longevity, as I say. Games would often have a sort of retirement mechanic, which would mean the players often rarely make it to like late 30s and 40s, which is what Jimmy Anderson has done in real life. Injuries, again, there's nothing to say that in the game, Jimmy Anderson doesn't break his leg, for example, and miss a year or two of test action, dips in form. And also specialization. So Jimmy Anderson very much is specialized in test cricket, and that's something that the game doesn't sort of replicate. So how does it shape up? Well, interestingly, it just looks like Jimmy Anderson's career, it hasn't had that second gear. You know what I mean? I mean, we've seen the wickets go up, but we see the average come down significantly. Basically, Jimmy Anderson continued his career on a pretty even footing. We're averaging 30.18 across those three playthroughs. Certainly a phenomenal test cricketer, picks up on average 530 wickets, which of course is a massive achievement, but an average of 30.18, he wouldn't be anywhere near the legend he is in real life, I think. I think that's fair to say. But yeah, you can kind of see the extent to which the game kind of puts a quality measure against Jimmy Anderson in 2014, and it just doesn't really change. His average drops from 30.68 to an average of 30.18. So it's kind of negligible, the difference we see in quality, whereas in real life, this decade for Jimmy Anderson has been sort of defining in his career and defining in his legacy. Now, Jimmy Anderson's longtime partner, Stuart Broad, he kind of has the phenomenal test career, legendary career that Jimmy Anderson in real life, in game. And it's interesting just how close these numbers are. Jimmy obviously gets nowhere near his 704 test wickets. Stuart Broad ends up with 604 test wickets in real life at an average of a little under 28. And yeah, it's actually very reflective. I mean, it's interesting that he plays less games and picks up a lot more wickets for a similar average. So he bowls a lot more in the game, clearly, because he picks up all those extra wickets, averaging out at 692 in that one playthrough, 743 wickets. I mean, he has a phenomenal career, but one where he's bowled an awful lot because, yeah, plays 165 games. So two less tests than in real life, but picks up, 140, nearly 140 more wickets. Incredible. So he bowls an awful lot, I suppose, is one observation we can make about Stuart Broad, but he does pick up a lot of wickets. And it's interesting that his average is so similar to what he achieves in real life, 27.58 as opposed to 27.68. Now, another standout is Dale Steyn. And I think this is, again, very interesting. With both Jimmy Anderson and Stuart Broad, you kind of see them having kind of stayed at a level for their in-game careers. And Dale Steyn kind of does as well. He's clearly a step better than these two bowlers, than Anderson and Broad. He picks up more wickets, averaging 716 at an average of under 25. So really significant output. And he plays 144 matches on average. Obviously, in real life, dogged by injury, we don't see the full Dale Steyn. So it's interesting to see this here of what might have been, if you like, for Dale Steyn. 439 test wickets at 22.95 in 93 matches. So, of course, a phenomenal career. But obviously, what might we have seen if he had played that little bit longer? And again, goes to the earlier point. Would South Africa have had, more success if he'd been around for longer? But yes, in terms of the quicks, Steyn and Broad stand out, yes, as the real top dogs for this 10-year period. So in terms of sort of other quicks to sort of look out for, Yeah, I mean it's interesting. So we've got Kemar Roach at the top. We've got Mohammed Shami, and we've got some interesting standard. Anyway, let's go through it. So Kemar Roach, another, interesting player. He has a very good in-game career. And again, I'm really impressed, to be honest with you, with the averages that um Cricket Captain 2014 puts out. It kind of says that this is actually, really quite a good simulator of the cricketing world, and clearly quite a good judge of quality of players. I mean, Kemar Roach at the top there, IRL. So at the point of putting this video together, he picked up 270 wickets in 81 matches at an average of 27.74. So a very fine career. Across the three playthroughs in Cricket in 2014, plays a lot more cricket, 115 matches, 521 wickets there. Absolute beast for the West Indies at 28.86. So average-wise, he's a little worse off, but he does pick up a lot more wickets. I mean, played quite a lot more games. So again, a bowler who seems to have bowled an awful lot, but has decent output to show for it. Secondly, you've got Mohammed Shami, so another player who has had an interesting career, sort of injuries and selection has kind of maybe limited his opportunities. I mean, he's certainly an elite bowler, but hasn't had the career that he might have hoped for, I suppose, at least for India. And again, all of these are based on test because the one day and the short form is such a mulch. But in terms of test, these are all sort of test averages. IRL, only 64 matches played, 229 wickets at 27.71. Very similar. 104 games played, 541. So again, a lot more bowling and a lot more wickets at 26.34. So again, a good pretty reflective, in game, pretty true to life. Now, when you're playing games like this, it's always interesting to see who, if any, players spring out from nowhere as being stars of the show that you don't expect. And the one that came up consistently was Harmeet Singh. Now, this was a really interesting one because Harmeet Singh actually played for the USA in the 2024 T20 World Cup. But he is in the game, he is a young Indian spinner. It's very interesting to see him actually having a career at international level at the end of this period in 2024-25, but it's with the USA. And there's something odd about Harmeet Singh's career because you look at his profile on ESPN or whatever, ESPN Cricket Info, and they talk about he emerged as a real talent at Mumbai in his native India. But then it says this: it says oddly he was ignored the next season by Mumbai, and then it references match fixing and some scandals. So really hard to make out, without being intimate with domestic Indian cricket and his particular story. Yeah, Harmeet Singh could well have been an elite player, but something goes on. He emerges and impresses for Mumbai as a youngster, but then drifts off the radar to the extent that he ends up playing in the United States and representing them in a T20 World Cup. But he consistently had a very good career in game across those three playthroughs, averaged out at 79 tests played, 472 wickets taken. And yeah, in terms of those averages, quite a clip better than the other elite players we've looked at, 24.59. So interesting to think what might have been for Harmeet Singh, perhaps if he'd had a better stab at it at Mumbai. But it's interesting that his success kind of runs parallel to Ravi Ashwin's lack of success. So here's a really elite Indian spinner who retired recently, having played 100 tests, 537 wickets at 24. In game, he just doesn't get going at all. 55 averages out of 55 tests played, 259 wickets at a little bit under 30. So Harmeet Singh is the elite Indian spinner for this decade. and Ravi Ashwin, a bit of a bit part player. An interesting twist in this sort of, alt history sporting world. So other players I thought I'd look at. So Alistair Cook. Now, obviously, he's had a career already at the time we start in 2014. But how close do we get to his real life output as Sir Alistair Cook, as he would be known by the end of his career? So not bad. Again, I think it is really good representation of reality, really, by the game, a good simulation. So his average across the three playthroughs, 157 tests played to 161. He scores more runs IRL, has a better average IRL, but not massively different. And if you're going to talk about Alistair Cook, I mean, one theme of this decade for English cricket fans has been the kind of turbulence at the top of the order, and in particular, who was going to be Alistair Cook's partner, particularly when Andrew Strauss had retired. And the answer, quite firmly, in game at least, was Sam Robson. Sam Robson. Now, Sam Robson, a high quality performer in domestic cricket, and he, like so many others, had a go at being Alistair Cook's test opening partner. IRL didn't really work out. Only the 7 matches played, 336 runs at a little over 30. The game gives him a far better chance. And he ends up averaging 85 games played over the decade, with nearly 6,000 runs scored, a little under 40. So, I mean, there's a question. Given more time, would Sam Robson have been the man for England? So many names came and went. A lot of them averaging out at 6 or 7 games, so a series or two before being moved on. But interesting that what might have been basically for Sam Robson had he been given a better shot at being at the top of England's order. So what about other batters? Well, here are some high performers that we know from the real world and the game world. Davey Warner, controversial character, loved by some, loathed by others. And Cheteshwar Pujara, who's always been a favourite of mine, a classic batsman, certainly can hit a shot, but sort of known for his high quality test temperament and ability to bat long and score big. And again, I just think it's interesting to draw these two out because you've got a decade worth of cricket, but the simulation is really quite good. So Davey Warner, even with his suspensions and controversies, he ends up with an average in game of 45.68 with 114 games played. And IRL, very similar. 112 games played, average is slightly down, run scored slightly down. But yeah, very accurate representation and a high quality career for both Davey Warner and Cheteshwar Pujara, who again has similarly good simulation numbers. Plays more, like he certainly has been in and out of the Indian team, and yeah, firmly off the radar now, despite still being a high performer in domestic cricket. But he certainly plays more in the game. Plays 120 matches, scores over 9,000 runs at an average of nearly 46. IRL, a good career, but perhaps 17 games and 2,000 or so runs short of legendary, as he plays 103 games, over 7,000 runs at a little under 44. So 2 elite players there who have had good representations in game. And here's 3 who probably haven't. Now, the not so Fab Four, I called this. Now, these are, if you like, the 4 elite batsmen of this era, and you can see those numbers really do jump out. You're talking about elite batsmen there with Warner and Pujara averaging in the mid-40s. I mean, you've got players here who are averaging well up in the 40s, if not the 50s. Now, Virat Kohli's had a massive slump recently, so when I took these figures, his average has dropped very significantly. But again, incredibly accurate. You've got to give cricket captains some credit here. a decade worth of cricket, but his IRL average at the point I took these numbers, 47.21. In game, 47.24, quite remarkable, zero point zero 0.03 off. And just very similar across the board, just one game played less in game, and in terms of runs scored, he is slightly behind. But yeah, averages out at a very good upper 40s. The same can't be said though for the rest of the Fab Four. It's all a bit of a mishmash. Kane Williamson, IRL, absolute star of the show, amazingly consistent at international level. He averages nearly 55 with over 9,000 runs scored in 105 games played. In the game, plays more games, scores less runs. It's a good but not great average of 42.84. Joe Root, yeah, doesn't have anything like the career that he does in real life. In real life, he's an absolute stalwart for England and one of the world's elite batsmen. He averages just shy of 50, having scored approaching 12,000 runs at test level in 140 matches. In game, yeah, it varied a lot, but in some playthroughs he played very little, and ultimately ends up averaging just a snip over 40 in average of 72 games played. So yeah, a very different career for Joe Root, and an even more different career for Steve Smith, a legend of the game for Australia. Again, a controversial character, but he's averaging in real life, he's approaching 10,000 runs, or at least when I took this data, it was approaching 10,000 runs with an average of over 56. But at the start, again, I think what we're seeing here is that the game is actually very good at giving players an initial quality value, but then it's not very good at having that go up or down. Good bowlers, good batters, they perform on a pretty flat level through the game. And Steve Smith certainly has had an incredible decade in terms of output, and that just hasn't been reflected in game. I mean, after all, Steve Smith, he enters the Australian setup as sort of an all-rounder. He's down the order, a bit of a bowler. I mean, now we wouldn't say that about him at all, barely bowled at all, and is a dominant batsman for Australia. So career changes and sporting output changes is something that the game isn't particularly good at representing, but does show remarkable levels of accuracy when judging players at a distance, if you will. So we've done the individual players. Now we're looking at international cricket. Now, obviously, there's a few things that aren't going to be modelled in game. Irregularities of schedules, the pandemic. So we do have like a far more consistent flow of competitions. But this is what we see. Now, remember, the second thing we're going to look at is how does South Africa get on, basically? And in my very first playthrough, they won the first and the second international competitions. And, as you can see there, in both playthrough 1, 2, and 3, they won at least one international competition. So, yeah, you can already see the answer there. But yeah, so, in terms of ODIs, it's an interesting mix. There's nothing glaring. I mean, this is the thing about cricket generally, as I said at the outset, like it is a game played by quite a small group of nations at elite level. So, you're never going to get something super zany like you might get in a football game where, I don't know, Burkina Faso have qualified for the World Cup and by Lordy they go and win it. That's not going to happen because the pool of teams that are engaged at the elite level is pretty small. So there's nothing here that would massively jump out. And, kind of so it proves. I mean, it does make for an easier sort of simulation of a game world, really, in that respect. But there's nothing that massively jumps out as shocking as we look through it. And this is how it kind of plays out. England sit at the top, having picked up a total of 7 titles across the 3 playthroughs. And then you've got South Africa, India, Australia, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan and New Zealand at the bottom there. Now, New Zealand would be happy with that because they've actually had a decent amount of success in recent years. But they're the bottom of the international pack. Now, there obviously are other international teams that could have been winning competitions. You've got Bangladesh, you've got Afghanistan, but yeah, no major shocks really across the three playthroughs. Now, again, one interesting thing to reflect on is like why England come out on top in the way they have. And again, that's partly, I think, due to game design. Because as we discussed, the gaming world of Cricket Captain is pretty small. And you don't see how domestic players and teams develop across different leagues. So the computer is developing teams, in these sort of like distinct leagues, and you don't really see how that progresses. But England certainly has the bigger domestic league, and by extension, sort of more players coming through. Now, it's interesting that India doesn't perform in this way because, again, there's a lot of the Indian domestic league is good. Because I suppose the kind of system is that every year, basically, in Cricket Captain, you get a couple of youth players, and there's a chance that any one of those youth players might be incredibly good. And one thing the computer does do is pick up on kind of regen players, if you like, and their quality incredibly quickly. So you do end up with a lot of international teams that very quickly are filled with regen players. And as the player, it's actually quite hard to judge how good they are. The game is not at all good in representing how good emergent talent is, because it's kind of reliant on simply playing averages, batting average versus bowling average. That's your one judge of quality. And if you've got a youngster who's only played one or two games, it's hard to know if that youngster is, the next Shane Warne or just somebody who's got lucky. But the computer seems to see the underlying numbers of the player and then starts to pick youth players quite quickly. So England certainly has an advantage in that it has more teams, therefore there's more young players coming through. Therefore, the computer, when it's doing the international management, can pick from a broader set of quality players. Surprised that India didn't perform better. Australia has quite a small domestic league. In this edition of the game, there wasn't any South African, Sri Lankan, Pakistani, or New Zealand, or Indian, I think, domestically. But you would have thought that'd be represented somewhere, that like the pool of players available to the likes of India, it just would be better. So I was surprised to see England win out the way they did. But when you reflect on how the game is working underneath the hood, I think that makes sense. And that in a way, and that's kind of goes to the heart of what this kind of series is about in a way. It's like looking at how game development and gameplay decisions influence how the gaming world plays out. So I think that is something that we can observe here in terms of that market increase in success of England across the three playthroughs. Now, I went into rating. So, so teams may not have been winning competitions, but how do they rank? So these are the test rankings. On the left, you've got IRLs, you've got India at the top, and across, the three formats, Test, One Day, and T20. So I've got them ranked here by average position. And I think, it's interesting that this is actually, again, it's quite accurate. It's quite accurate. Now, in the alternate timeline, unsurprisingly, the teams that were winning competitions are the teams that are ranked better. So again, you've got England at the top, South Africa and India as the top three in terms of their ranking across formats. And then you've kind of got the middle ground of teams that were not having success in international competition, but, shake out, roughly as you might expect in extension. So Pakistan, they didn't win competitions, but, broadly speaking, they're performing well, given that. And the same would be true of Australia, and then New Zealand, Sri Lanka, and then you had very limited success for West Indies, Bangladesh, and Zimbabwe. So when we look at it, alongside, the bottom four are exactly the same. And then by extension, obviously, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the top six are the same. So I think that's pretty good. It's a pretty interesting and pretty good representation, I think, of the simulation. I think the simulation has done rather well there. Um, again, England have massively outperformed themselves. They're top. The average out at 4.7 and fourth IRL, but they're top. South Africa, they're second as opposed to third. India are third as opposed to first. Australia have massively underperformed. I mean, they've dropped from very firmly second, being, the top ranked test team, and second in the other formats to being some way off the pace. So there's certainly some differences there, but all in all, it's a remarkably good simulation of this decade worth of international cricket. And as we said, in terms of those themes, South Africa do far better in the game than they do in real life, and Australia actually do worse. So it's a flip-flop. And that flip-flop is represented almost almost sort of exactly in the Ashes. That's the third thing I'm going to look at. The Ashes, so up there I've got test win percentage. So IRL, Australia have won 56% of tests over this period, with England winning 28. In the alternate timelines, it's a total flip. I mean, it's very interesting. We talk about the accuracy of the simulation, but one thing that is certainly true is that England massively outperform in the game. And again, in the Ashes, it's a flip, 32 to 56 in favour of England. But what is interesting is when you look at the individual results, it's not as dominant as it may seem. So in the first playthrough, England did win out 14 to 8 with 3 draws, but they only won 2 series. They won 2 series, Australia won 2 series, and there was a draw. Exactly the same result really in the third playthrough. 2 wins for Australia, 2 wins for England, 1 draw, 11-11. But the kicker is that second playthrough, and I don't know what happened there. England win every single Ashes series, winning 17 tests. Australia winning 5, and there's 3 draws. So it's funny that in this area there's sort of a consistency and then a real outlier. There's a real outlier in that second campaign. Yes, it amounted to up to 42 tests played, 29 losses. So 42 test wins across the 3 campaigns, 42 wins, 24 losses, 9 draws, 9 series wins, 4 losses, and 2 draws. So yeah, England, dominant in this particular format, but notably because of that outperformance in the second playthrough. An interesting one there. So then let's look at it. So yeah, Jimmy, what became of the legends? Well, I've given them an A. I'm just going to rank these, I think. A, B, C. So good, bad, or ugly, really, in terms of how the game does its simulating. What becomes legend? Well, good. I think good. I mean, some of those averages you're seeing for batters and bowlers are remarkably close to life, given 10 years worth of data that the game is developing, basically. Some significant outliers. I mean, some of the stars of the decade simply didn't happen. Jimmy Anderson's career sort of continued its trajectory. Joe Root, Stephen Smith, they did not emerge as greats. Say the same for Kane Williamson. But ultimately, in a lot of places where you pick out the numbers, remarkably good simulation. But obviously, the game can't represent how players in real life have altered their technique, altered their playing role, altered their playing style, had significant periods of good form or bad form. That's just where the game plays out quite differently. But I think we can certainly say that there's a remarkable amount of accuracy really in how the game simulates certain careers. And then for the plight of South Africa and Australia, well, B and B, because South Africa probably should have won more titles. And in an alternate world that obviously closely resembles our own, which is what this experience basically is, South Africa will have won one of those titles. So I think it's fair that South Africa should be winning. And in a way, maybe the game is more representative of real life, where South Africa have, yes, bottled it significantly. And then, well, yeah, for the Aussies, it's not been so great. But I think, what we've said from South Africa, they could be equally true of Australia. It's they've certainly performed, but what is in that sense, what stands out is England's overperformance. And obviously the titles that England have won, other nations haven't. So there's definitely a game bias there in this edition, at least towards England. And as I sort of discussed, quite possibly because of the larger database of new gen players that emerge because of how the game has been created, with the underlying domestic competitions of England being bigger than those of other nations around the world. So yeah, overall, the history, does it make sense? I'm giving Cricket Captain 2014 a B. Is it a good game? Go out and try it for yourself. As I said before, lack of innovation and stagnation with the genre, lack of competition for cricket management games and cricket games in general mean that it can be an unsatisfying go. But in terms of tracking sporting history, it's pretty good. A good simulator of sporting history and an interesting one to look at for this particular project. So thanks again for tuning in, guys. Much appreciated. And I'll see you on the next one.